Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Qatar Leadership Panel, which will discuss the open access scene in Qatar, where we will have the chance to talk about achievements, opportunities, and challenges regarding the evolution of open research and open science in Qatar's context. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our esteemed panelists. Starting to my left, Huism, the Executive Director of Qatar National Library, Rosena Nhlabatsi, from Senior Intellectual Property Policy Expert at Qatar Research and Development and Innovation Council. We have also Dr. Khalid Fakhro, Chief Research Officer, Sidra Medicine Qatar, and we do also have Dr. Aiman, Erbad, Vice President for Research and Graduate Studies, Qatar University. I would like to ask our esteemed panelists to briefly introduce themselves and introduce the institution, if you don't mind. And then we can start the discussion with some warm-up questions, and then we can dedicate some questions to specific panelists. Please.
Hello. Ahlan wa sahlan, everyone. As Dr. Noof has mentioned, my name is Huism. I'm the Executive Director here at QNL. I think Excellency Dr. Hamad has given you already a broad view of what QNL has been doing to support open science and open access. And I think this is really one of the core values of libraries around the world. And of course, QNL subscribed to this value is equitable access to information. And yeah, I think I will pass the mic on to Rosena.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning. My name is Rosena from QRDI. So we are a research council. One of our strategic thrusts is to provide funding for research and innovation. So I am in the policy planning and evaluation team. I am an IP expert, and my role is to make sure that we have the right policies and incentives to enable research, innovation, and related activities such as open science. So happy to be here and to share what we do at QRDI. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, my name is Khalid Fakhro. I'm the Chief of Research at Sidra Medicine. I'm also a Professor of Genetics and Genomics. At Sidra Medicine, we care for kids who are really sick. We're a pediatric tertiary care facility. We also do women's health. In terms of research, we're very heavy on genomic research. We lead the genomic research agenda in rare disease.
This is Aiman Erbad. I'm the Vice President of Research and Graduate Study at Qatar University. I'm also Computer Science and Engineering Department. So today I want to share a little bit about Qatar University. It's the largest national university, 29,000 students, largest graduate student body, probably the largest contributor to research in Qatar. 1,300 faculty members, has 12 colleges now and 17 research centers. So open access is something that we take very seriously, and we'll talk today about how we managed to achieve part of that and what we need more in the future.
Thank you so much. Since you ended with that, I might actually start with that. So as we know, open access means access to research articles and books, right? So in which content is made freely available without restrictions. Open research goes beyond that, because we've been talking about this is beyond open access, open science and open research. And extends openness to all research outputs, from research data to other parts of scientific process, including open peer review. What does open research mean at your institution? So what are some of the activities that the institution is doing to support open access? Speaking of how many students you have, how many faculty members you have?
Thank you. Thank you for this. This is a really great questions. And I think the reason it's great because whenever we talk about open, it's open access. People think about publications. So if we start from there, Qatar University, we did the study from 2018 to 2023. Open access publications out of the total. So In that study, we found around 15,000 publications, Scopus indexed, and out of that, around 8,000 are open access publications. So more than 50,000 of what Qatar University publishes is open access. But it's not only that. It's definitely much more. We have our own library with their own Q-space system, and that's the system where all thesis, all student outcomes gets published, and it's open access. We also have a lot of conference proceedings, especially local conferences that go online as open access. And we are now starting to encourage faculty members, people who are working in the university and publishing, to have a process where they can publish their outcomes before they hand over the publication rights to the publishers, so it becomes in the open. Another thing we have also in Qatar University, we have the Qatar University Press. And now all of our journals, the journals that have been traditionally and still now published by the colleges, they have one in business, one in Sharia, one in law, one in two in social science and humanities, and all of them are open access. All of them are also Arabic, almost all of them. Business, I think that one is in English, and law, bilingual, but the other ones are Arabic. And we are trying to push for these journals to also be indexed by Scopus and by Web of Science. Already one of them is indexed by Web of Science. And we are trying also for all the books we publish through the Qatar University Press to have all of these books open access. So more and more people would have a chance to read them. So in general, Qatar University is trying to push more and more of their outcomes, more and more of their journals, books to be in the open, and maybe we'll talk more about data sets and other issues in the next round.
So much. Dr. Khalid, how can institutions like Sidra Medicine and Hamad Medical Corporation, HBKU, do more to support open access publishing?
To follow up on the first question first, because I think it's important for us to also speak from the perspective of a hospital and open access and what kind of work that we're doing. So in addition to being a hospital, Sidra Medicine was really built with this tertiary mission to deliver clinical care, education, and research. And so education and research are two very, very foundational pillars to the way we approach medicine, et cetera. And because we have a very unique positioning as a national genome center, and we have patients in our parts of the world, and sorry, patients at our hospital that represent the wider parts of this region, we tend to be one of the first places to make fundamental discoveries around the genetic structure of the Qatari population and around the kinds of genes and biomarkers involved in diseases that we see here. And of course, we don't have a fully free academic model, as you might find at a national university, but we're also not a completely private model where everything is IP insulated and tucked away. We kind of straddle the line in between, where as scientists we want to make sure, and as clinicians we want to make sure that the research the discoveries we make impact as many lives as possible around the world. But at the same time, there will be some limitations to what you can and can't share, and at what point you can and can't do it. Primarily around two things, one being IP and the other one being the patient privacy and patient consent. But one of the main examples that we do rather frequently at Sidra is because we run a number of national cores, including the core genome lab for the country. We are constantly at the front end of innovation in terms of lab techniques. And so it's very common for, sometimes when you do lab technique papers, you're not looking for an academic publication, you're really looking to put a method into the literature. And so it's important to get these out as fast as possible. And so we do encourage our scientists and our cores to submit preprints, to submit to open access, et cetera. But of course, within the limitations of the funding available to support that.
So much, thank you. Rosena, I'll ask you a general question, then I'll dig into more details. So how can funding bodies integrate open research mandates into their grant requirements, and what are the challenges in ensuring compliance for such requirements?
Well, like from the previous section, funding bodies, research councils, providing funding grants to institutions, one of the key things that we can do is to make sure that we have the right policies and procedures in place to enable this to happen. So, for example, we see funding agencies like UKRI in the UK, we see Horizon EU in Europe, we see NIH in the USA. They are always enabling open access data. Open science is always enabled through the policies. So, for example, if you want to make sure that the research institutes, the universities, the researchers are actually able to make their public outputs open, you need to enforce that in terms of a mandate. So having open access mandates within the policies that enable that every research output coming out of the research that is being funded by the research institutes, by the research councils, the funding bodies, is actually available for sharing. And this is one of the key things we can do. And not only that, we can go beyond having procedures that enable this, because having a policy is not enough. So having the right procedures in place, for example, at QRDI, we do have the data management plan that we work together with the QNL here. And we also have data privacy policies, as well as data sharing policies. So all these policies enable the work that we want in open science to happen. And when we talk about open science as we all understand it now, that it goes beyond just data, we have policies in place such as equipment sharing, because we heard about open hardware, and this is something that we are also advocating. We are allowing institutions to share hardware because we want to make sure that collaboration is flourishing by avoiding duplication of equipment share, by enabling that researchers are able to know that there are facilities and assets elsewhere in other organizations that they can actually have access to. We have a portal, QRDI portal, where we put all the publications there, all the research profiles, all the researcher profiles are there so that they know each other. And this is how open we're becoming. So having the right infrastructure, the right procedures, the right policies to enable open science is fundamental for funding bodies.
Great, that's great. Thank you so much. Ms. Tan, I have a question for you. His Excellency pointed out the role of QNL in leading open access support in Qatar. We also heard some from our keynote speaker, Dr. Hilal, and talking about the collaboration, etc. And the role of libraries as a space or place for supporting open access. What I want to ask you is that the Qatar National Library Consortium, consisting of more than 10 institutions in Qatar, work with QNL to negotiate, read, and publish agreements. These agreements move beyond the subscription, of course, and provide open access tokens for publication or publishing in all research in Qatar. This has increased the number of publications or articles in Qatar over the last 6 years. How this consortium has worked well? Has it worked well? And where it faces some challenges? So how the scene has changed for the consortium over the years? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Noor. So obviously, I think as our lead has mentioned, the idea of actually setting up a fund to help with open access took place, I think, in 2015, but it was only sometime in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, 17, that we actually launched the fund. And I think we've seen a great growth in that, but as you will speak with my colleagues who manage the fund, we get a lot more demand than we at QNL can support, because obviously QNL is not a research body. We are not a funding body either. We as a library help to support and advocate for open science and open access. But at the end of the day, there is a limit, because as a library, there are other operating areas that we would need to look at, and the funds that we have allocated for this. But the consortium has been very, very useful. I mean, obviously, we've learned a lot with working our different partners. Some of them who are here at the table with us. But there are obviously always new things we can do to perhaps refine the processes a lot more. And I think these are conversations that we always have with our different partners. So inshallah, it will get smoother and smoother. But truly, I think for Qatar as a whole, and I think Professor Hilal had brought it up very clearly, is that there is perhaps no specific body that is looking at a national open access or open science policy and getting that sort of a bigger body to see how they can support the overall ecosystem.
Thank you so much. Stan, I would like to touch upon that and ask Dr. Khalid or Dr. Aiman about the open access publishing fees. Speaking of a consortium and paying fees for open access. Open access publishing fees extracted from academic community could soon rival the cost of serials. Such high publishing costs and centralized control over research would augment inequalities in academic publishing, both in terms of authorship and shaping the future of open access publishing landscape. Do you think academic-led publishing initiatives are needed to counter the imbalance of power over journals and challenge inequitable publishing practices? And that would, to some extent, take some of the weight off the library to support open access as well. So your thoughts on that?
So can I take the, so I totally agree, actually, and I will tell you some facts. The main, I think, outcome, and I told you more than 50% of our publication is actually open access. And to be honest, after we did the study, and I'll tell you the study result, we came out to the conclusion, the most valuable thing that we get out of this is a culture of openness. A culture that keeps the outcomes of the research in the public domain so other people can see it, read it, and utilize it. And the other reason where a lot of people think open access can help, where it's citation, we realize actually the same citations, open access, not open access, the same citation. And we were surprised. We said, oh, why? People do it because of citations. Actually, it's not the case. We realized that there are two reasons it's not the case. The first reason is that more than 88, maybe around 90% of our publication are published on Q1 and Q2 journals in Qatar University, the Scopus Index. So already, most of our publications are in very strong venues. And when you publish in strong venue, whether it's open access or not open access, it doesn't matter a lot. The second reason I think this is not the case is that many people, even who are publishing in the traditional journals, are going now and on their own, they are doing ResearchGate or Archive, those open access systems. Very common now in all of engineering disciplines and medicine and medical colleges. So that's why we realized that if we are, as universities now, know the benefit that we are getting out of this is really just to keep things in the public, what we can do is those national repositories, institutional repositories, have policies in place with the help of the funding agency, with the help of the university, and with some enforcement at the college and the grassroots level to allow people to open source, just put it there before you give your copyrights, put a draft, maybe not the final one with all the final edits, but something that will make sure that it is in the open, it is useful, and keep targeting top venues where you will get exposure, and then people will go and look at you and you will always be there. So I think going back to that, I think we will be able, if we put the right policies, the right infrastructure, and now with the support of QNL, we already put the culture of openness. I think we can really cut a lot of cost and get away from this very expensive model of open access.
Again, we publish a modest number of papers per year versus the national average. But what we do is we incentivize higher impact science. So if it's a journal that is above a specific impact factor, then we pay for it centrally, as opposed to the PI or the investigator having to pay for that paper. And so from that point of view, you do get a centralized sort of funding, even for open access journals. The challenge with the national system for open access is, and I know this from firsthand for some papers from my own lab, you try to publish open access and then you email them in February and the funds are gone already, right? And that's because the demand nationally is apparently far supersedes the availability of resources, unfortunately. And I think if you want to talk about open access more aggressively, we talk about challenging the traditional model of publications, right? So it's funny to talk about open access, but also talk about impact factor, because the two of them may not necessarily be the same thing. If you want to champion open science, some of the top impact factor are very closed journals. But there's also a balance between the ability to put stuff out there and the necessity for peer review, which is a very important thing. Now, again, that doesn't justify the cost, because peer reviewers are not paid. If they were paid, then it would justify the cause. It would justify the cost for publication, but they're not. But I mean, the point is, as we saw earlier, Dr. Hilal and some of the examples of some papers out there that get sensationalized, but they're not adequately peer reviewed. There could be a huge cost, societal cost on this. So it's always a balance that you have to strike, both inside the institution and on a national level. I think it's marvelous that QNL has taken that step to champion open access. I think now on a national level, there's been a lot more attention on this idea of intellectual property and how we're protecting it, and there's always going to be a small balance that one has to strike between these things. And then for us, from Sidra's perspective, because we deal a lot with patients, we always have to also be conscious of the consenting process and what the consent allows and does not allow, not for the publication side, but for the open science component. So some patients consent for sharing of their data, and some patients do not consent for sharing of their data. And so you really need to be conscious of that when you're making a decision on how open my science is going to be. We saw earlier, again, the example of a condition that affects adults with patient engagement and being involved, and it's okay because you're dealing with adults who can fully consent. And in our setting at Sidra, we deal with pediatrics. And with pediatrics, many of them have issues with the ability to consent, maybe intellectual disability or other comorbidities. And so how do you strike that balance between bringing the patients on board and getting their consent and opening the data versus the privacy concerns that are required to take into consideration? So these are all things that we need to consider. But in principle, we want to champion as much access to our data as possible.
So quickly tapping on that, and also Dr. Amr from the previous panel mentioned about incentives. So how can we work on incentive? Like there are positive incentives, but there are some also obstacles to open access. How can we work on the positive parts to encourage people to do more open science and more open research?
So of course there are the direct incentives, which is, we're going to cover your publication, etc. There are some more national incentives that one could do. You could use metrics to measure, which organization is publishing the most amount of work in open science or open access journals. Of course, you do it per capita, but then there's also the possibility of introducing an annual award, right? And then really incentivizing scientists to really top those charts and try to make sure that their data sets are being made available. I have a lot of anecdotal evidence of data sets in my lab where I fought really hard to make sure the consent allows sharing of data on global databases. Now, of course, when you share patient data on global databases, you don't just put it in open databases, it's controlled access. So it's a form of open access. You need to vet who's going to access it and for what. But there are these kind of middle grounds that one could use when dealing with data that has privacy issues around it. However, there are many levers I think that we can pull on a national level to try to encourage this kind of behavior.
That would be great. Thank you so much. Rosena, I have a question for you, if you don't mind. So open licensing of research outputs not only allows for greater dissemination of information, but also fosters innovation. And because we talked about, or we heard about innovation in previous talks. The potential for content reuse, such as an AI training for big data, is vast. Do you see a link between open research and innovation, and if you have any thoughts
Well,
on this.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the question meant is about whether there's a strong link between innovation and open science. So I think before I answer the question, I think we need to understand the reason why there is this question. Often you see open science, open data seems to be against innovation for some sectors of society, because when you look at intellectual property, as we discussed before, intellectual property is all about safeguarding, while open science is about releasing. And because of this, there's always this myth about the fact that if you release, then you're going to lose your intellectual property. In a way, it's true, but these things can work together because they're not mutually exclusive. For example, there are so many ways in which you can safeguard IP without having to compromise on the open access. You need to know when to apply for IP protection before you go ahead to do open science, or you need to know what aspect of research you can put towards open science, while others you can put towards commercialization. So to answer the question, there's a very strong link between open science and innovation. And I'll say in a few examples. One example is when you look at innovation being the ability of institutions or people to create new knowledge, this can directly happen when you make research outputs available. Because if you make it more widely accessible, then you know that so many people are going to have access to that, and institutions that are not even research institutions, such as startups, for example, can actually tap into that knowledge to do commercialization. This fosters collaboration on so many levels. In Africa, we have a saying that says, if you want to go alone, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, you need to go together. And this is very important as well in this context, because you see, when you make research outputs available widely, you are allowing dissemination, and you're allowing more people to access that. You're allowing more innovation to happen. And you talk about AI models. When you talk about open AI, for example, it uses data that is already in the public domain. This is availability of data that is there, that is enabling them to make models, machine learning models, AI models, that can actually train their own models. So the interlinkage between innovation, open science is there. The most important thing is to kind of demystify the fact that these two do not go together. And one way to do that, if we talk about incentives, is to provide training. Training is very important because researchers, research institutions, they need to know that there is this possibility to innovate if you can also make it public. And these days we talk about innovation. We understand that innovation is no longer linear. In 2003, we had the concept of open innovation, where we know that innovation is not just about one institution creating innovation using its own research output. It's about allowing other institutions to also come into to tap into your research, your innovation, to do more. And this can only happen if you enable open science. So in a way, there's a very, very strong link, and should be something that should be encouraged.
Tap on this, if you don't mind, because you're talking about the accessibility as well. And speaking of accessing open science, so many believe there is a conflict between open research and IP rights. Speaking of the IP rights, how can we preserve the IP rights while we are still embracing open access?
So there are so many ways in which you can do that. One way is, for example, you can put an embargo on the outputs that you believe that you can actually protect IP for. So when you put an embargo, what it means that you are allowing protection of the IP to happen for a certain time, and then you release it. Once you do that, you are protected at the same time you're allowing for open access. That's one way. Another way is to actually identify ways in which you can customize your IP rights. You see, there are licenses such as the Creative Commons licenses. This is one way in which you can actually identify what you need as a researcher in order for you to actually protect some rights. The Creative Commons, as we all know, there are so many ways in which you can actually allow permission at different levels. For example, you can say, I'll allow you to use this, but I'm going to hold off on the non-commercial aspect of things so that you don't do commercialization. So that's one way in which you can control. There are so many ways in which you can do this, and just understanding that you can actually do both is very, very important. And the fear that we see for non-compliance, for example, is that I'm going to lose my IP rights if I go ahead to publish. This is something that we can provide training for, awareness for, to all the researchers, research institutes, so that they know that this can actually happen without compromising. And if someone else has to say that, being me, because I am the expert for IP and I know the importance of not releasing in the public domain, it's important that we understand that this is something that can be done. We just have to have the right procedures and policies in place to enable this to happen.
Thank you so much on that, Ms. Tan. I have a question for you. Speaking of, again, the collaboration, because again, Qatar National Library has been doing the heavy lifting when it comes to supporting open access and open research in Qatar. So the open research requires a lot of collaborative efforts across different sectors, of course. How can these stakeholders, libraries, funders, hospitals, grant agencies work together to overcome barriers to open access on a national level to some extent? Well, we can, it's for discussion, of course.
But I think maybe I would like to, highlight that actually QNL has been working with various research institutions and of course with QRDI to support open access and open science. And I think the work that the team has done with regards to Manara is a very good step, because Manara, which is our digital repository, research repository that we've done for Qatar as a whole, enables institutions and individuals to put their research on the platform that QNL will then preserve. With this concern about IP rights and everything, you actually, whether as an institution or as an individual, able to determine what access that you provide for individual articles. But yet, having with an embargo period and having the idea that eventually you would be able to release that article or that data set, available for other researchers to use. And I think the scalability, I mean, if you talk about business, is very important. And as Rosena mentioned, it enables others to tap on the research that's been done, that has been paid for, nationally, and that to be open for other people to reuse. I think that that's extremely important. And that as a library, we were trying to facilitate that platform for people to put that research on board. And I think what libraries are good at is doing discoverability. So we aggregate, we ourselves are not research institutions. We do not necessarily produce the research, but as libraries, we are very good at aggregating and making discoverable these research papers and content and information. And that's the role that we as libraries are trying to do and support the ecosystem.
Thank you so much. So I'll tap also on that because for us, compared to Europe and other parts of the world, the Arab world lacks open policy mandates. Speaking of supporting open science and open research, there are some at King Abdullah University, for example, of Science and Technology, University of Palestine, American University of Sharjah, on a university level that mandates open deposits to the repository. What can be done to achieve this in our institutions like Sidra or Qatar University, or on a national level supported by QRDI or QNL? So it's basically, if we go back to the question of incentives or a policy, or what can we do on a national level to do that? Because the panel just before us, they were talking on a regional level. Can we reach that as well to do more of a collaborative effort to mandate open science and open research in the region? Your thoughts?
If I may just start the discussion. So from a policy perspective, when we talk about our policies that we have, the procedures that we have, the collaborations that we have with QNL, the data management plan that we have, all these cannot happen if we do not have the support of the the institutions where the research is actually coming from. So what we need for us to all work together is a collaboration. Collaboration framework is very important, because when institutions know that QRDI is requesting for open data publication, then institutions should also have policies that are institution-wide policies that say, we encourage open access publication in accordance with the policies of QRDI. So that alignment is very fundamental. And I think when we have that alignment, that's key. Also, we can all advocate for legislative reform. So this is something that we can all do together, because if everyone is talking about this, the importance of this, we're going to make sure that we have that body that Dr. Hilar talked about. We need something that we don't have here. And one way to do that is to advocate for that as a group. So I think that's one way in which we can work together as different stakeholders, having different mandates, but one goal to make sure that we achieve this.
I think if we talk about maturity and growth in terms of just our understanding of open science versus open access, I think we have been through a lot now in terms of understanding, but we still, at the grassroots, I'm talking about researchers, people who are working, we still are not there yet. Like, what is open science? Like, if you talk about my field, in the past, I have shared code online. I have shared data sets that I curated over time. I have shared even protocols, like ethics protocols in some of the, and I share them in different places. I share them sometime on my international thing. Sometimes I share it in a code repository, which is famous. This is not the case in all sciences and in all areas across different disciplines. So I really like, usually before we start putting policies, is to really get out there and have a good framework of understanding open science as an institution, Qatar University, or as a nation with many very well established organization, and then identify the roles. What am I good at? Like, we know libraries are good at archiving, making things discoverable. Universities are good at maybe generating outcomes and maybe managing part of it, especially student work. And if we come to a good understanding, I think we have these open discussions and maybe some leadership from QRDI or from some of the universities, from the libraries. I think together, if we establish this framework, it will allow us to put more awareness, more policies, and eventually platforms that will be used to enforce this policy and or to achieve this policy. And so I think we are still at the level where we need to understand more, talk more about open science, especially that we have a relatively new research community. I mean, QRDI, maybe 15 years old, and our universities, Qatar University, was mainly teaching until maybe 2005, 6, and 7 when the funding. So I think it will take us a little bit more work to build the culture, build the policies. But to be honest, if I tell you about my vision, I hope Qatar University in the future will have much more people involved in open science, even at the student level. Even our students, we should teach them from their third and fourth year when they start that you need to share. Sharing is good because you will be able to solve more problems. You will be able to enable people. I am hoping also for our centers who have been collecting data for years, environmental data, other types of data that might not be as sensitive maybe, or maybe not, to think about what are the privacy issues involved and maybe start sharing publicly, but even start with sharing with, for example, companies, environmental data or other types of data. Maybe they cannot share publicly for some reason or the other, but they can have some agreements where people can share, enable some business sectors, enable more analytics. People who are doing surveys can share this data, so they will enable. So then it will be sort of deriving the economy, deriving small businesses, and that's where we will get even more culture for sharing and better policies that can decipher the privacy versus commercialization versus just good humankind and sharing of information. So I think in Qatar University, we will hope to build that, but we believe in incremental but solid changes with policies, with more awareness in order to enable it.
Thank you.
Nationally, that's another.
Thank you so much. I will ask also Dr. Khalid about that. So do you think it's moving mountains when it comes to open science, open research in Qatar?
Yeah. So let me give you a couple of examples, and then I can a small glimpse of where the future can be, right? So one example I think is an example of open science where we got an unexpected feedback from the community. So we were one of the first groups in the world to advocate for sharing genomic data from the Middle East. And the Middle East is the most difficult place in the world to share genomic data from, because people are constantly afraid that there's going to be bioweapons made that are going to target us for some reason. Honestly, nobody cares. The reality is that when you share genomic data from this part of the world, it ends up helping patients in your local community. It ends up helping Middle Eastern patients who are seeking treatment in the UK, in the US, in Korea, wherever they are in the world, because they can access this data. So we were one of the strongest believers in sharing this data, and so we consented a large cohort of people who we were enrolling to research early on. And we put this data under controlled access so that it can only be used for academic use. And then, of course, the academic community started citing this data a lot, and it became incredibly useful. Everyone was thanking us because Qatar was the only country in the world that was sharing genomic data. It's a small data set, but it was so useful. And then you started getting people coming out of the woodwork who are interested in all of this Y chromosome, ancestry, and all that stuff. And they start emailing you and calling you and saying, can you give me the Y chromosome? Can you give me the haplotype? Can you give me this? Can you give me that? Can I use it for this? And they all have commercial use in their mind, right? And so it kind of, I mean, it's innovative of them to use the data set for something else, but that's not part of the consent process, right? And so we pulled the Y chromosome out of that data set. So the data set's sitting there. So instead of using it for disease, they're using it for other purposes, right? So sometimes you get those kinds of things. On the other side, during COVID, we have one of the most actively innovative genomic labs in the world. And when the supply chains were all constricted for COVID testing materials, we innovated a new method that can extract RNA using beads, which is a different. This was all house-made, home-cooked recipe, and it was working brilliantly. Like when on a national level we can do tens or hundreds of tests, our lab could do 4,000 tests in a day, right? And so we decided that this is very useful for the rest of the world, and we published this open access immediately because we knew people had to do it. 2 weeks later, you couldn't find any more beads on the market. Everybody was buying the same thing that we published. And thankfully, we had the prescience to order a large quantity ahead, right? But where do I think this is going in the future? I think the entire publishing method will be disrupted. There are now companies that use blockchain technology to incentivize open access, open science. There's some companies where you can put your papers, you can put your preprints, you can put your entire data sets up there, and that give you tokens and response to the institution, not to the individual. So they incentivize the institution, and the institution gets the ability to then publish more and so forth. Every time someone from your institution goes in and reviews a paper, your institution gets more tokens. So it helps that. And every single thing you put, whether it's a data set, a paper, etc., they're all non-fungible tokens. So they're all NFTs. And that creates a permanent record on the blockchain that this is your paper and it belongs to you, so you have all the IP rights for it. So there are these kinds of innovative approaches that are currently emerging, and I think we're going to see more of them. And so it's a combination of using these things to try to change human behavior.
Stan, any final thoughts on that?
No, I'm great.
Great.
I think, just want to emphasize that, collaboration and discussion is the way to go. And I think, as we're saying, it's still quite new here in Qatar. And I think today is a great, this event, anyway, is a very good start for us to really talk more about it.
I do believe we have a couple of minutes for questions. If anyone from the audience has any question, please just say your name and your institution. Any questions? We're good? So I believe, is there a question? No? Oh, no. Okay, so I believe that's 2 minutes early for the break. Thank you so much for coming, and I would like to thank our esteemed panelists, Ms. Huism, Rosena, Dr. Khalid, and Dr. Aiman for your invaluable input into the open access, open research, and open science context in Qatar. Thank you so much. Have a good one. Thank you.